Hey guys, this is Mitch with FinePoint CGI, and today we're going to talk about how to create a scalable magic system. So this is kind of a part 3, I believe, of our little magic system project that we're doing. And we're going to go through the process of creating our magic controller. We're going to go through and create our base spell and then have everything kind of inherit from that base spell. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and cast that spell and do some damage to our enemy. Now, this will probably end up being a multi-part series here because each time we create a spell, it's going to be a little bit of work. So we're only probably going to get through one, but I know there are multiple spells that we need to get through. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to build our magic controller. And our magic controller is going to basically allow us to cast spells, and it handles a lot of our magic logic. Now, I know that we did a little bit of magic stuff before with our potion and things like that, so we might need to go in and refactor some of that, maybe in a future video or maybe in this video, depending on if we have time. But let's go ahead and make a magic controller and we will go from there. So I'm going to right click on RES. I'm going to say new script and I'm going to call it magiccontroller.cs. And then I'm going to double click on that and that'll open it up inside of Visual Studio Code. So our magic controller is going to be pretty simple. We really can't do much without having our spells and things like that already put together. So unfortunately, this is borderline useless right now, but we do need to have it. Now, what we can do is we can go ahead and lay the groundwork here. So we could have a public void cast spell. And what that's going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to cast our spell. So we'll go ahead and just lay that in here so that way we have a function already built. But basically the idea is that our magic controller will cast our spell and will handle all of the lower level spell stuff. So right now we're done with this, but we're definitely going to need to come back to it in the future, probably soon. So we have that. So let's go back to Godot. Let's right click on our RES. Let's create a new script and let's just call this spell with a capital S. You'll go ahead and create that. And our spell is going to be a class that is going to hold all of our information about our spells that's generic. So things like mana cost, things like damage amount and stuff like that. And we also want to allow us to override our values. So what we're going to do is we're going to do what's called an abstract class. And an abstract class is something that says, hey, this class can be overridden by another class, if that makes sense. So, you know, the nice thing about this is we can inherit from this and get all the cool properties from it, but we also gain a lot of flexibility. Now, since this is a 2D game, I'm going to inherit it from a node 2D. Whoops, 2D. So that way it's inherited from a node 2D. I'm going to get rid of this little bit of code here. And we're going to go ahead and say private string resource path. We're going to go ahead and say public int damage amount. And then we're going to go ahead and say private int speed, which actually you might want to make public, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. So let's make that public. So that way it's accessible outside of the project. And then we're going to go ahead and do public float mana cost. And now from here, we can go ahead and define functions that we want to make sure that the classes below us have, which is really useful if you're going to be calling generic code. So what we can do is we can go public abstract void cast spell, and we can do that. And what this is going to do is anything that inherits from this class needs to implement this. So you have to build this. You can't just not have this in your class. And the reason why this is useful is because then you can generically call this function from multiple different classes that all inherit from this spell. Now, I know that that's confusing, so I'll explain it more in detail once we get to this point, but it's a really, really cool feature. So from here, we'll go ahead and say public abstract void load resource path. And then we're going to say public abstract void setup. So each spell is going to have a setup, right? Because you need to set up your spell for it to work. And we'll go ahead and use the semicolon there. So that's basically what we're going to need for now. Now you can see that we have this ready here. We'll go ahead and pull that out. We don't need that. And that's basically our spell. Now there's some additional stuff that we might need to add later, but at least for right now, that's what we have. So the nice thing about this is it allows us to really build our spells so that way we don't have to have that additional information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to our damage amount and I'm going to export it. So now everything that inherits from this spell will have their damage amount exported so I can change it later. And I'm going to do the same thing with my speed. I'm going to export that. And I don't like that it did that. And I'm going to go ahead and go to my mana cost and I'm going to also export that. So now anybody that inherits from this will have these values exported automatically for us. So that way we can reference them in our code without needing to have that additional code. So now the first spell that we're going to do is going to be an IceKnife, right? So we're going to come back to our Godot engine. We are going to come up here. We're going to right click and add in a new script and we'll just call it IceKnife. Simple enough. We'll go ahead and double click on that and we will actually inherit up here from our spells. Or from our spell, I should say. You'll see that we have an underline here. IceKnife does not implement inherited abstract member, cast spell, setup, or load resource path. So what that means is the game's not going to work unless we have a setup, a load resource path, and a cast spell. Now, we may not need our load resource path, but I'm going to put it in anyway, just in case. I can't remember if I need that or not. So we're coding a little bit on the fly here. So what we're going to do is we're going to implement these inherited members. So the first one is spell.setup. So what we can do is we can say public override void setup. And you'll see suddenly if we come up here, it's gone, right? From this thing, it doesn't say that we need to implement it anymore. So basically what we're saying is, hey, we are creating this setup function, but we are overriding it with our own functionality. Now, I know that seems weird, but trust me, it's very useful. And it'll become apparent very quickly once we start actually coding our project. So we'll come here, we'll go public override void, and we need to go ahead and do our cast spell. And you can see that when I hit tab, it says, hey, we're going to throw a not implemented exception. That's fine. And we'll do the same thing. Public override void load resource path. And you're going to see that it automatically threw a non-implemented exception as well. So that way, if we try to call it, it's not just going to do nothing. It's going to say, hey, you haven't implemented this, which is good. So now from here, what we can do is we can go ahead and set up our scene for this IceKnife here. So let's go out to Godot and let's go ahead and go scene, new scene, and let's make it a 2D scene because we need to, because our IceKnife inherits from our spell, which inherits from node 2D. So we need to make sure this is a node 2D. So what we can do now is we're going to need a few things. First, I'm going to name this IceKnife. So from here, we can go ahead and get our sprite in here because we need to have a sprite. So let's do sprite. And then we're going to need to have some collision. So we'll go ahead and add in an area 2D. And we need to add collision to our area 2D. So let's add some collision. So we'll add a collision shape. And then a collision shape always needs a shape. So we'll come over here and we'll create a rectangle shape. So now that solves that. And from here, we need our sprites. So what we're going to do is we are going to go out and fetch ourselves an IceKnife sprite set. So we'll go to itch.io here, and we will go ahead and type in knife. Let's see if IceKnife works. It doesn't, so let's see if we can do ice shard maybe. Oh, there we go. There's a good spell. So you can see it looks perfect, actually. It looks exactly like what I would expect. So let's go ahead and click on ice shard. And then let's go ahead and click download now because it's free. So we'll say no thanks, take me to the downloads, and we'll go ahead and download this. And you'll see that it's going to dump out a bunch of PNG files. So let's go ahead and go to downloads. Let's right click and extract it and extract it. Awesome. So now we've got our spell. Simple enough. So what we can do is we can come over here. We can copy this. If we go to ice shard, copy it. And then we go back to Godot and we right click on our RES and open in file manager. That'll give us our little file manager here. And we can right click, new folder, and we will call it spells. And then we're going to go inside of there and paste our ice shard. Now Godot is going to go through and do some importing, which should be pretty quick. And we are going to go into our ice shard and we're going to select all of them, go to import, preset, and 2D pixel. And that will allow them to be a 2D pixel. Simple enough. So now we can go into our scene, go into our sprite, come up here, and drag in our little sprite. And you can see it's a huge sprite, but we don't want it that big. So let's go ahead and drag it down, make it a little smaller. It's still way too big. So let's make it a bit smaller. Something like maybe that. That seems reasonable. There we go. Simple enough. And let's make sure that this is zeroed out. So if we go to transform, we go 0, 0, so it's perfectly centered. Same thing with our area 2D. Let's make sure that that's perfectly centered, and our collision shape, because I grabbed onto that. Yeah, it didn't quite zero out. And then let's adjust this so that it matches the shape we're looking for. Awesome. So we'll go ahead and hit Control S, and we're going to save this as IceKnife.tscn. And there we go. So now it's saved, and actually I think I'm going to take my IceKnife.tscn. Let me see, because we got to start organizing this project. It's getting too much. So we'll take our IceKnife.tscn, we'll drag that into our spells. So now we have it underneath that. And we'll go ahead and find our IceKnife CS file, and we will drag that up to our IceKnife here and drop it in, and it will go ahead and link that script with our IceKnife. So we'll go ahead and hit Control S. So now that we have all this hooked up, let's go ahead and make it so that our IceKnife can detect collision, right? Because when it collides with something, it needs to do something like do damage to somebody, right? So we'll go ahead and click on our area 2D. We'll go to node and we will say on body entered, because we're going to be doing damage to bodies only, right? We'll right click that, connect it to our IceKnife. And let's go ahead and take that and copy it and connect it. And then we can come down here and say, hey, public void on area 2D bodied enter, object body, and then we'll go ahead and do that. Awesome. Simple enough. So now that we have this, we need to go ahead and set up all of our casting code with our magic controller. Because like I said before, our magic controller handles casting our spells, right? So if we come up to our magic controller, we'll come up to our cast spell and we will go ahead and say, okay, so first we need to go ahead and have an equipped spell. So what we'll do is we'll come up here and we will say public packed scene equipped spell is equal to, and in this case, I'm going to directly make it equal to my resource loader. So I'm going to actually just load that resource dot load. And we're going to quote res : spells / and you'll see that it automatically picked up my IceKnife here. So we'll click on that. and then we'll do a semicolon. And you'll see that it gets mad at us and it says, hey, whoa, 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 we cannot implicitly convert type Godot resource to a Godot pack scene. You need to cast it, right? Are you missing a cast? Yes, we are, right? So we're going to say as a packed scene. And what that's going to do is that's going to tell the resource loader to load our IceKnife as a packed scene so that way we can use our equipped spell. Simple enough, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to come down to our cast spell. We can go ahead and say spell current spell is equal to equip spell.instance as spell. So what does this do? Well, what this is doing is it's saying, hey, grab my equip spell, that's my pack scene, and instance it, and then say it's a spell. But this spell is an IceKnife, right? So how can we get away with instancing something that's an IceKnife, not a spell, right? Well, since it inherits from spell, that means that we can say it is a spell because it inherits from it. So therefore you can say, hey, I know it's this type. I know it's a spell. Even if it just inherits from it, I know it's a spell. So I only need to call the things that is in here. I don't need to call the thing specifically that's in here, if that makes sense. So basically, as long as we stick with these three methods here, we can get away with just casting our spell through calling it a spell, if that makes sense. So, and if it doesn't, I'll be more than happy to explain it a bit more. So what we'll do is we'll hit enter. We'll say, hey, current spell.setup, right? Because if we need to do any setup on that spell, we can go ahead and do that. And then we can say, hey, game manager dot global game manager dot add child current spell. And then we can go ahead and say game manager dot player dot mana update mana minus whatever their current mana amount is, right? Minus whatever the spell's cost is. So current spell dot mana cost. And we'll make that minus so that way we can minus whatever the mana cost is. So if the spell is free, right, it's going to cost 0. But if the spell is something that's more, more expensive, then it's going to cost whatever it is that we set it to. So the beauty of this is this will work with anything that inherits from this spell, because everybody has these specific things. They have damage amount, they have speed, they have mana cost. Everybody's the same in that retrospect. We can go out here, click on our IceKnife, go to our inspector, and you'll see that our exported parameters haven't shown up yet. And that's because we haven't built. So let's go ahead and build this and let's see if we have any build errors. And if you click up here, there is a build button. I forgot to mention that. But you can see, there we go. So our mana cost, let's say for this spell, is going to be 10. The speed of the spell is, 50. The damage amount is 5. Okay? And we're going to go ahead and save that. And now what that means is because this inherited from this, it shows up here, even though it's not in here. That's the power of inherited classes. And that's kind of the power of abstract classes. It allows you to override stuff. So now that we are at this point, what we can do is if we look at our magic controller, we are now casting a spell, which is good. We can go ahead and open up our player controller, and let's go ahead and set up the ability to cast a spell. Now I know that this isn't perfect, right? Where it's going to instance this at the center of our scene, so it's not going to actually do what we want, but that's okay. And don't worry, it's not a big deal. One thing that we should check first before we jump over there is setup. Let me make sure that my IceKnife, okay, my setup is empty. I wanted to make sure of that because we don't need that. And we may not need these, but I have these for just in case. There are some things that I'd like to maybe expand upon in the future, so we'll just leave those for now. That should work. Okay, so that should work. So what we're going to do now that we have this set up is we're going to go over to our player controller, and we will go ahead and add in a new function here. So let's go ahead and minimize this. So let's just go ahead and collapse a couple of these so that I can see what I'm doing. There we go. So now we can actually see what we're doing a little bit. So what we'll do is we will come in here and we will say, okay, private void attack and cast our spell, right? But we don't have access to our magic controller because our magic controller doesn't exist yet, right? So we need to go into our game manager and we need to add that access. So we'll say public static magic controller, and we'll say magic controller. And then we need to go ahead and say, hey, on ready, magic controller is equal to a new magic controller. And that'll allow us to just go ahead and have a magic controller that exists in our world. So from here, we can go ahead and access that from our player controller. So we'll go into our player controller and say, okay, game manager dot magic controller dot cast spell. And we're going to need to go ahead and have some kind of animation that goes with this, but we'll get with that. We'll get to that in a second. So we'll go ahead and save this. And then we're going to scroll up to our physics process here, which at this point we're starting to get pretty busy in here. We might need to move over to a state machine at this point because this is starting to get really complicated, right? And a state machine would definitely clean a lot of this up. So we might need to investigate that for our next video. So we can go and find a good place to put this. So it's kind of something I'd like to do at the end, so that way it kind of takes precedence over everything. So we can come down here to, I don't know, here-ish, or maybe down here. Well, we don't really want... Yeah, we could do it after they get mana. That seems fine. So we'll come here, and we will go ahead and say if input dot is action just pressed, and we are going to say if attack is just pressed. Now we don't have that functionality yet, but we'll go ahead and put it in, and we will say go ahead and attack. So now when the player hits the attack button, they will go ahead and attack. Simple enough. Now we need to go into our Godot engine, and we need to go into our project settings and input map, so that way we can hook that up. So we'll go ahead and say attack, and we will add that in, and we'll go ahead and make that button a key, and we'll make that X. Simple enough, and we'll hit OK. So now if we go ahead and hit play, right, and our game is running, if everything we did is correct, which who knows, if we hit X, it should have placed a spell somewhere. Let's see. Doesn't seem like it's doing anything because it would be in this general area. So let's go ahead and see if it is firing off our attack spell first. So let's go over here. Let's hit let's go over here. Let's hit a breakpoint, and let's go ahead and go to our run, and let's play this in editor, and let's see if it's even getting to this point. It might not be. So Godot is now running, so we'll hit X. Okay, so it's definitely getting to this point. So we will step down. We're going to see our attack. We'll step in. Oh, Godot is being unhappy with us, probably because we waited too long. So let's try and see if we do that again. See if it gets past our attack. It's going to cast our spell with our magic controller. So if we go ahead and hit X, it goes into our magic controller. So we'll step in. And you can see that it does come in here and attempts to instance our spell. It does our current setup, add child, update mana. Go ahead and put a breakpoint here, see if it's getting to this point. I don't know why my Visual Studio is being dumb, but that's okay. I've been having some issues with it lately. So we'll go ahead and run that again. We'll hit X, and it is definitely firing off our spell. Even our mana is getting updated. So if I hit play, our mana went down to 90, so that definitely worked. And the spell exists in the scene. Oh, there it is. I don't know why it wasn't. Okay, well, that's fine. So our spell now exists, so that's good news. That's what we wanted. It's very large. We should probably make it smaller, but that's okay. So that's good. Okay, cool. So now that we have that, yeah, we need to close our Godot project here because it crashed on us, but that's okay. Now that we have this, it's instancing our spell. We need to instance it in front of our player, and our spell needs to move, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into our Godot project, and we're going to go into our player, and we're going to add in some spell casty stuff, some fancy stuff, right? So what we can do is we can go ahead and say, all right, let's add in a child node. Let's add in a position 2D. Let's go ahead and place that in front of the player, like so. So we'll go ahead and drag this in front of the player, and we're going to call this spellcast right. And then we're going to go ahead and duplicate this. So Control D, and we're going to change the name of this to spellcast left. And we're going to grab this and move it negative 11.96. I don't like 0.96. We'll just do 12. And then we'll go ahead and change this to 12 as well. I don't like it when it's that close to 12. There we go. So that'll work, right? So now what we could do is on our spellcast, we can just get our player's global location and then fire off our spell. Simple enough, right? So we'll go over to our Visual Studio. We'll go to our magic controller. And since our magic controller is handling our casting, we can just come in here and say, okay, so we know that we're casting our spell. So let's come in here and say, all right, current spell dot global position is equal to game manager dot player dot get node position 2D quote whatever we named it. So in our case, so spell cast, we'll say right. So we'll go ahead and copy this. So let's just rename, copy, and then paste that in there. And that's going to go ahead and give us our spellcast location. We'll say dot global position. And that will set our global position to our player. Simple enough. Now, from here, we need to go ahead and make sure our spell is smaller because it's going to immediately collide with our player. And I'm not a huge fan of that. So let's go ahead and just make our sprite much smaller. So let's make it something like that, maybe. And let's change the size of our collision shape to match. So we'll bring that down in size quite drastically, and we will save it. So now if we play and we hit X, it should deploy the spell right in front of us. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. So now from here, we need the spell to move forward, right? We need the spell to actually, if I show you guys, as cool as this spell is, it's not going at anything when we cast it, right? So we need to get this to move whatever direction it's facing that way. And also you'll notice if we hit left and we hit X, it still casts right here. And that's going to be a problem. So we need to have it cast that direction, right? And we also need it to update and flip, right? Because it needs to go that way. So what we can do is we can Alt-Tab back in. And let's go ahead and first grab our face direction. So I'm going to come up to our cast spell and say bool face direction. We're going to say, hey, if face direction, then go ahead and set it to this location, right? Else, the face direction must be the opposite, right? So we'll just duplicate this code here, and we will change this to left. And that's going to go ahead and flip our node to cast off of this side over top of this side. Now we need to do our next big thing, which is flipping our sprite, right? But I don't like how our setup spell doesn't take in our flip direction. It would just be easier if it just took in our face direction, right? So if we just pass in our face direction and then go into our spells and change our setup to take in a Boolean face direction, then we can go into our IceKnife, come down here to our setup, and you'll see our setup suddenly says, hey, you need to take our face direction, right? No suitable method has been found to override, right? That's because we need to add in our Boolean face direction. And that will go ahead and allow this to once again be in good standing with our class that we have over here, right? So now from here, and I know it seems like, why would I do this when I can just do it a different way? The reason why is it's just a lot more flexible in the future to do it this way than it is to do it manually and have a lot of duplicated code. We're going to say get node sprite dot flip h is equal to face direction. So now if the face direction comes in, it's going to face that direction. Now, something else that we're going to need is, since the spike is going to be going in a specific direction, we need this face direction to be global, right? So that way anything in here can say, am I facing this way or am I facing that way? Now, we could do this a lot of different ways. We could just get our node flip h and then just use that. But I think it would be easier just to use this face direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my spell and I'm going to come up here and say private bool face direction. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow me to use that face direction as my global variable, if that makes sense. So if we go into our IceKnife here, and I actually lower this d to a lowercase d, because I don't want to have some duplication here. I just don't like it. We can actually come in here and just go face direction is equal to face direction. And now that is global, if that makes sense. Oh, whoops. Face capital D direction is equal to face direction. And I think it's going to get mad at me because it's private, which is my fault. So this needs to be public. My apologies. So go ahead and make that public, and then now it works. Okay. So the reason why, actually, before I move on, is you can't inherit something that's private. So this is not going to be inheritable, which means it's probably useless to us. But I got some fanciness that I think I'm going to do later with this load resource path. We're probably going to use this to load our resources. So that way we don't have to load it inside of our magic controller. Instead, we can just load it inside of here. But that's something that we'll look at in a little bit. But that's why this needs to be public, is because you can't inherit something that's not a public variable. So we'll go back to our IceKnife. And so now what we need to do is we need to go ahead and move our IceKnife over every single frame until it hits something, right? So what we can do is we could uncomment this process. I don't think I'm going to do that because I don't want to go off of delta. I'd rather go off of physics. So we'll go ahead and delete this, and we're going to say, hey, public override void underscore physics process float delta. And we'll go ahead and get rid of that base. We don't need it. And we will go ahead and say, hey, if face direction, then position minus equals our transform.x, right, times delta multiplied by our speed. If you remember, we have our little speed parameter that we had, and that will handle this. And then we could say else position plus equals transform.x times delta times speed. Simple enough. Now, there is a way that we could compact this a little bit more by basically creating a ternary operator here, or we could probably do some fanciness where we just convert it to an integer or something like that. But I think that this will work for what we're trying to do. So now, if we tab back into our project, we have a failed for our build. So you can see there's no argument given that corresponds to required formal parameter, face direction. So if we double tap on that, you can see that we have our cast spell. That's my fault. So we need to go ahead and pass in our player controller's animated sprites flip H value, right? So we can say, is the player facing this direction or this direction, right? So if we say game manager dot player dot get node animated sprite, and we quote it and say animated sprite dot flip H, and that'll pass in that value. So that should basically pass in everything that we need. So if we come over here and we hit play, it should handle it. And from here, we can go ahead and see our IceKnife flying. Now you'll see that it's the opposite. It's coming from the behind, right? But it's actually working. Everything seems to be working other than that. So let's go ahead and tab back into our Visual Studio Code, and let's go over to our Magic controller and just flip this. So left and right. And that should work from now on. So if we fire it, perfect, perfect. So something you'll notice though is it just keeps going, and it'll keep going forever, which is not good. We don't want that. We want it to kind of fizzle out as time goes on, right? We want it to delete itself if it's, not going on forever, right? We don't want it to exist forever. We need to have a lifespan of some kind. So let's go ahead and close this, and let's come over here and go into our IceKnife, and let's add in basically like a time to live, right? So that's something that we might want to put in all of our spells, right? Because our spells aren't going to last forever. So we could actually come in here, go into our spell and say, hey, let's export this. So that way everything can have a different lifespan. Public float life span, and from here we can come in here and say, hey, lifespan minus equals delta, and then we can say if lifespan is less than 0, then go ahead and queue free. And that'll just go ahead and delete it before it goes on forever, right? So the nice thing about that is if we come up to Godot and then we go to our IceKnife, you can see when I build this, it's going to add in a new parameter on our IceKnife. So you can see our lifespan. So we'll give that, 10 seconds, let's say. And that's a pretty decent lifespan, I think. It'll be off the screen definitely by then, right? So it'll work out perfect. So now that we have all of that, and I know this is a lot of information. I'm sorry, guys. I know this is a lot. So what we're going to do is we need to go ahead and set up our damage system, right? So that we can actually do damage to things. So if we come down here and we go to our on area 2D body enter, we can go ahead and say, hey, if body is slime, let's say, all right, slime enemy, then we are going to go ahead and do damage to it. So we'll say slime enemy, slime is equal to body as slime enemy right here. And then we're going to go ahead and say that the slime needs to take damage. Now, I don't think slime actually can directly take damage right now. So let's go ahead and check. Does it have a damage code? It does not. So we're going to have to build that. So first we need to give the slime health. So let's go ahead and say private integer health. And let's scroll down here and let's say public void take damage, and let's take in an integer damage amount, and we'll go lowercase d. And then we're going to say health minus equals damage amount. And then we will go ahead and say, hey, if health is less than or equal to 0, then we're going to want to query free. And that will go ahead and kill our slime, right? So if we come back to our IceKnife and we say, hey, slime dot take damage, and then we can pass in the amount of damage that we do, which if you look at our spell.cs, it's just damage amount. So we'll come over here and say damage amount. And actually, I think it's capital D, isn't it? Yep, capital D, damage amount. And there we go. So if the body hits a enemy, it's going to do damage to it. Now, we're going to want to do some refactoring of our enemy system, because we can't just say if body is this, if body is that, if body is this. That's just going to be too much work. So what we can do instead is we're going to inherit everything from an enemy class, I think, and then we'll go ahead and just say if body is enemy, then take damage, right? Now, what else we need to do is we need to also queue free our spell here, so that way our spell disappears if it hits anything. So if we go back here and we hit play, and we come over here and we cast our spell, as soon as it hits that wall, it disappears. Simple enough, right? It doesn't go through it anymore, which is perfect. That's what we want. If we come down here and we shoot our enemy, it misses it, probably because is our, let's check, is our, okay, so I figured it out and I feel stupid, but our collision shape is tiny. See how low it is to the ground? So even when it goes up like this, it doesn't actually, you can't actually hit it. So what we need to do is we need to make our collision shape taller, pull it up, and let's make it so that when the guy's all the way down, which it looks like, that will work just fine. We'll pull this up so that way he can actually get hit by things. And let's make him jump. There we go. And that will pretty much solve our collision problem. Now, I'm kind of curious how this is going to solve the colliding with the player, because the player may get caught up on this. Although, if I remember correctly, the layer that the slime is on is 2, so it shouldn't cause a problem. The player should just be able to walk right through them if they don't touch their area 2D, so we should be okay there. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we need to go over to our IceKnife and change our area 2D's collision layer to be layer 2 along with layer 1. So that way it can collide with both. So if we control S and we play this, it should now detect our collision. So if we run down here, drop down and hit X, you'll see it deletes our slime. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. So awesome. That literally is what we wanted. So that's good. All right. So now that we have this, we need to add in some additional effects, right? We want this thing to actually look good and play good, right? So what we can do is we can right click our IceKnife, add in a child node, and go ahead and add in an animation player. And we're going to go ahead and make 3 animations. So we'll go new, and we will call it idle. We will call it cast, and we will call it finish. And these 3 spells are going, or these 3 states are what our spell will be in. So it'll either be in the casting state, the finish state, or the idle state, right? The idle state is when it's flying through the air. So we'll start off with the idle state because that's going to be the simplest. So what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and click on our sprite. We'll click on our texture and we'll put in a keyframe here, and we'll just create a normal keyframe. And you will see here that we've already got our correct texture here. So that's perfect. So if you click on it, you can see right there, it's the correct texture. Then we're going to move over to our cast. We're going to go ahead and click on our sprite, add in a keyframe, and create it. And we'll scroll up to our ice shard, and we will start with our first PNG. So we'll drag this in, drop it in, and drop in a keyframe. We'll move forward a single frame. We'll drag this in, hit keyframe, go up another frame, drag this in, keyframe. We'll drag this in, get another keyframe in. We'll go ahead and pull this over, drag it up, keyframe, and you'll see that this is a little on the larger side, so we may want to adjust it because you'll see that it does one of these numbers, and I'm wondering if we're going to want to move from here this over so we can actually just drag in we can just come over here and add in a transform, and then we can go back a frame, keyframe it, go forward a frame. Oh, whoops, actually go forward to this frame, keyframe it. Let's pull it forward just a tiny bit like this to kind of keep that same magic ball dealy-do here. So you'll see that it goes boop, and that will work perfect. We'll go forward a frame. We'll go ahead and grab this one, and we will go ahead and keyframe it. And then our last frame, we're going to go ahead and use our little IceKnife spell. So actually, it didn't keyframe. That's my fault. So we'll drag this up, keyframe, and then we'll go forward one more, drag this in, and keyframe it. And then we need to go back. So if we go, actually, is this? Yep, that'll work. And then we need to go back a bit. So we'll go back so that now this is perfectly dead center again, and keyframe it. Cool. So that will work. So now that we have this, let's go ahead and say on 0.6, it's going to be the end. So we'll say 0.6. Perfect. And now we need to go to our finish state. We need to go to the front and go ahead and keyframe this. Create. We will go forward one frame. We're going to go ahead and put this in and keyframe that. We're going to go drag this in, keyframe that. We'll go in one more. We will keyframe that. We'll go in one more, and we will keyframe our last one. Awesome. And then we're going to go 0.5, so that way it grabs that last little bit, and it kind of shows it so that we can actually see it. Because if you don't, it might just kill it right after this. Now, from here, we need to go ahead and add in those animations. So let's go into our script here. Let's go up here. On our ready up here, let's go ahead and fetch our animation player. So we'll say get node animation player dot play our cast. Now, I don't like this because this is going to be very inefficient. So let's go ahead and come up here and say animation player is equal to, and we'll go ahead and say player is equal to this, and then we'll hit enter and say player dot play cast animation. Awesome. So now we need to come in here to our physics process and say if not player dot playing is playing, there we go, then I'm going to go ahead and say player dot play idle. And that's going to go ahead and play our idle animation. Simple enough, right? Now, from here, we can go ahead and say, all right, once you hit something, I want you to play your death animation, right? So player dot play, and I believe we called it finish. So we'll say finish. Awesome. So now if we go to our script here and we run our spell, I'll hit X, you'll see that it casts it and then it throws it. Now you'll notice that the first problem is it casts it and it hits, and it looks like it just disappears. Also, when we cast it, our spell is moving before it's actually finished casting. So let's go ahead and fix that first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a Boolean up here called able to move. And that's going to default to false just because we've instanced it. So it'll be defaulted to false. And we'll say if able to move, then do all of this bit of code here. And that will allow us to not move our spell until it is ready to be moved. So what we can do now is we can go, actually, we're going to need to make this public, aren't we? So we'll go ahead and make this public. And now we're going to go to our Godot engine. We'll go ahead and build this. So that way we have that public variable available to us. We're going to go to our animation player. And we'll go ahead and grab our track. We'll say property track, and then we'll go to our IceKnife, hit OK, and we are going to go ahead and, oh, see, it didn't show up. So let me see. Did I save that? Yes, I need to export it. That's why. So we'll go ahead and export this. If able to move. Perfect. So now we can go over here and we can go ahead and build this. So now it's going to be built. And then let's go ahead and add in that property track. Let's hit OK. And then let's grab our able to move. And then we're going to say on finish, we are not going to be able to move. So you'll see that this is now set to false, right? And on start, after our cast, right, we're going to be able to move. So let's add in another property track, IceKnife, able to move, open that up, right click, insert a key, click on that key and go ahead and click check. Now, if we save, when we cast our spell, it's going to allow us to move, or it's going to allow it to not move until we have fully casted our spell. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. But now this is disappearing before it actually is able to play its dead I'm dying animation, right? So let's solve that. So if we come into here and we have our queue free here, let's actually get rid of that. And let's come down here and say public void remove spell. And we'll just go ahead and call queue free. Simple enough. And we will save that. Now, if we go into our Godot engine, we go back to our animation player, and on our finish, we'll go ahead and add in a call method track. We'll click on that. We'll click on our IceKnife, and we will go ahead and add a key here. And we can go ahead and call our remove function, providing that it actually existed, which of course it doesn't. Although I think we can actually just call it right here, queue free. So that's something that is perfect. So we actually can get rid of this. That's my fault. So we'll go ahead and save. Save this, get rid of that, and then go ahead and hit play. And you will see that once we run over here and we fire off our spell, bang, it completely finishes its spell and then it disappears and it no longer exists. Awesome. That's perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. So now if we're fighting our little slime guy, we fire off our spell, you can see that he disappears. It does its cool little shatter animation. And perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. So that is all I have for you guys today. So in the next video, which will be coming out probably next week or the week after, we're going to go through adding 2 more spells, probably something like maybe a healing spell or a levitation spell, and maybe a lightning strike or something like that. I mean, we'll have to figure out what we're going to do, but that's where we're going to do a little bit more refactoring and a little bit more playing around, making this robust system a lot more robust, right? But we at least have the baseline of a pretty decent system. So if you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. If you dislike this video, go ahead and hit that dislike button, even though it looks like it's getting removed apparently. yeah, if you guys have any questions, leave a comment below and I'll be more than happy to get to you. Or you can hit me up on our Discord. Link is in the description below. And yeah, that's all I have for you guys today. So thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you all next time. Thanks.